On the afternoon of January 26, 1945, Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy stood alone atop a burning M10 tank destroyer near the French village of Holtzwihr, gripping the handles of a 50-caliber Browning machine gun. Below him, the vehicle's fuel tanks smoldered, fire licked at the turret. At any moment, the ammunition inside could detonate, turning the tank destroyer into a steel coffin. But Murphy didn't move. Through the smoke and falling snow, he could see them coming. 6 German tanks advancing down the narrow dirt road. Behind the armor, 250 German infantrymen in white winter camouflage moved through the frozen fields. They were close, too close, within 10 yards in some places. Close enough that Murphy could see their faces. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Germans had already killed the tank destroyer's crew. They had shattered Murphy's company. 102 of his 120 men were dead or wounded. The officers were gone. Murphy was 19 years old, and he was all that stood between the advancing Germans and the complete destruction of his position. The machine gun before him was a weapon the Germans had learned to fear. A weapon that had changed the mathematics of infantry warfare. A weapon that could do something most soldiers thought impossible. It could penetrate steel. The 50-caliber Browning M2 had been stopping German armor since North Africa. Tank crews who had rolled across Europe with impunity, confident in their steel shells, had learned a brutal lesson. Armor that could stop rifle bullets, that could deflect machine gun fire, that could withstand grenades, could be torn open by a weapon carried by a single American soldier. And on this frozen January afternoon, Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy was about to demonstrate exactly why German tank crews had come to hate that distinctive sound. The deep, hammering roar of Mar-Deuce. Before we trace how Murphy came to stand on that burning tank destroyer, we need to understand the weapon in his hands and why it terrified the men it was designed to kill. The story begins not in 1945, but 27 years earlier, in the final months of the First World War. In October of 1918, as that war ground toward its conclusion, a prototype weapon was tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. It was a machine gun, but not an ordinary machine gun. This weapon fired a cartridge half an inch in diameter, 50 caliber, 12.7 millimeters. The bullet weighed over 700 grains, more than an ounce and a half of metal. When it left the barrel, it traveled at nearly 2,900 feet per second. The kinetic energy was devastating. The prototype had been requested by General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force in France. Pershing had seen German aircraft protected by armor plate. The Junkers J was a ground attack plane covered in steel that could shrug off the 30-caliber machine gun fire that filled the skies over the Western Front. American pilots reported emptying their guns into these aircraft and watching them fly away, seemingly undamaged. Pershing wanted a weapon that could penetrate armor. He specified a caliber of at least 50 and a muzzle velocity of at least 2,700 feet per second. Those numbers were not arbitrary. They represented the threshold needed to punch through the armor that was beginning to appear on modern battlefields. The man who answered Pershing's request was already a legend in American firearms design. John Moses Browning had been inventing guns since childhood. Born in 1855 in Ogden, Utah, he had designed his first firearm at age 13. By 1918, he had created some of the most successful weapons in American military history. The M1911 pistol, the M1917 water-cooled machine gun, the Browning automatic rifle. Browning's approach to the anti-armor problem was characteristically practical. He took his existing 30-caliber M1917 machine gun and scaled it up. The operating system remained the same: short recoil operation, a closed-bolt design, belt-fed ammunition. But everything was made larger and stronger to handle the massive 50-caliber cartridge. Winchester developed the ammunition. They started with a rimmed cartridge intended for an anti-tank rifle. Pershing rejected it. He insisted on a rimless design that would feed more reliably from belt links. Winchester complied, creating what would become the 50 BMG cartridge, Browning machine gun. That designation has endured for over a century. The first prototype was tested on October 15, 1918. It worked, but not well enough. The rate of fire was below 500 rounds per minute, too slow for aerial combat. The muzzle velocity was only 2,300 feet per second, below Pershing's requirement. The gun was heavy and difficult to control. World War I ended 3 weeks later, on November 11, 1918. The armistice came before the weapon could be perfected. But the work continued. American ordnance officers had captured German 13mm anti-tank rifles during the war's final months. The Mauser T-Gewehr fired a 13.2mm round with a muzzle velocity of 2,700 feet per second. At 230 meters, it could penetrate 1 inch of armor plate. Winchester studied the German ammunition and improved the American 50 caliber round to match that performance. By 1921, Browning and engineer Fred Moore had produced the M1921 machine gun. It was water-cooled, which meant it required a heavy water jacket around the barrel to prevent overheating. With the cooling system filled, the gun weighed 121 pounds. Without water, it still weighed 79 pounds. The weapon was tested extensively during the 1920s. It proved reliable and devastatingly powerful, but far too heavy for infantry use. The water cooling system made it impractical for mobile warfare. The gun worked beautifully as a fixed anti-aircraft weapon or a naval gun, but soldiers in the field needed something lighter. The solution came in 1933. Engineers replaced the water cooling system with a heavier air-cooled barrel. The new barrel was 45 inches long, substantially thicker than the water-cooled version, designed to absorb and dissipate heat through exposure to air. This modification reduced the weapon's weight dramatically. The air-cooled model, designated M2 Heavy Barrel, or M2HB, weighed just 84 pounds with its tripod. A two-man crew could carry it. One man served as gunner, the other as assistant gunner and ammunition bearer. The weapon could be mounted on a ground tripod for infantry use. It could be fitted to vehicles as an anti-aircraft gun. It could be installed in tanks and tank destroyers. It could arm aircraft as a fixed forward-firing gun or a flexible defensive weapon. The versatility was unprecedented. The M2HB fired from a closed bolt, which improved accuracy. The bolt locked closed before firing, creating a stable platform for the round to ignite and the bullet to begin its journey down the barrel. The barrel had a quick change capability, allowing crews to swap out a hot barrel for a cool one during sustained fire. The rate of fire settled at between 400 and 550 rounds per minute, a steady, controllable pace that conserved ammunition while delivering overwhelming firepower. What made the weapon truly revolutionary was the ammunition. The 50 BMG cartridge came in multiple variants: ball ammunition for general-purpose use, armor-piercing ammunition, designated M2AP, with a hardened steel core that could defeat armor plate, armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, API, which combined penetration with incendiary effects that could ignite fuel and ammunition inside a target, tracer rounds that burned bright enough to mark the bullet's path for observation and fire correction. The armor-piercing ammunition was the key to the weapon's anti-armor capability. The M2 AP round could penetrate 1 inch of homogeneous armor plate at 200 meters. At point-blank range, penetration increased. The hardened steel core would punch through armor, creating a hole that allowed the bullet to continue into the vehicle's interior, striking crew members, igniting fuel, detonating ammunition. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds were even more effective. The incendiary compound would ignite on impact, creating a flash of flame and heat inside the vehicle. In tests, API rounds could penetrate the side armor of early German tanks and set the vehicle ablaze with a single well-placed shot. By the mid-1930s, the M2 Browning had been adopted for service across the American military. The Army used it as an anti-aircraft weapon, mounting it on half-tracks and trucks. The Navy installed it on ships as close-range anti-aircraft defense. The Army Air Corps fitted it to aircraft, where its combination of range, hitting power, and reliability made it the standard armament for American fighters and bombers. But in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began, few people outside the American military understood what this weapon represented. The Germans certainly didn't. They were about to learn. Germany began the war with a tank force built around the Panzer I, Panzer II, Panzer III, and Panzer IV. These were the vehicles that had smashed through Poland in 27 days. These were the tanks that would break through France in 6 weeks, that would drive deep into the Soviet Union, that would seem, for a time, unstoppable. The Panzer I and Panzer II were light tanks. The Panzer I carried only machine guns. The Panzer II mounted a 20mm cannon. Neither was intended for tank versus tank combat. They were reconnaissance vehicles and infantry support platforms. Their armour was thin by design. The Panzer I had armour between 7 and 13mm thick. The Panzer II's armour ranged from 5 to 30mm, with the thickest plates on the front. The Panzer III was Germany's main battle tank in the war's early years. Designed to fight other tanks, it carried a 37mm gun initially, later upgraded to a 50mm gun. Early models had 15mm of armour on all sides. This equal thickness reflected German concern about anti-tank weapons attacking from any direction. Later variants increased armour to 30mm on the front, sides, and rear. The heaviest armoured Panzer III models, produced from 1942 onward, had 50mm of frontal armour with an additional 20mm plate bolted on, creating 70mm of protection on the front. Side and rear armour remained 30mm. The Panzer IV was designed as an infantry support tank. It carried a short-barreled 75mm gun intended to fire high-explosive shells at fortifications and troop concentrations. Early models had armour ranging from 14.5 to 30mm. The Panzer IV Ausf. F, produced from April 1941 to March 1942, increased front armour to 50mm and side armour to 30mm. Later variants, the OSF, G and H, produced from 1943 onward, had 80mm of frontal armour. But even on these later models, the side armour remained 30mm and the rear armour was just 20mm. These specifications tell a story that German tank crews would learn through bitter experience. The front of a German medium tank was well protected by early war standards, but the sides and rear were vulnerable, and the 50 caliber Browning M2, firing armour-piercing ammunition, could penetrate 30mm of armour. It could penetrate 20mm of armour. At favourable angles, at close range, it could even threaten 50mm armour plates. The implications were profound. A weapon that could be carried by 2 men, that could be mounted on a jeep or a truck or a half-track, that cost a few $100s to manufacture, could destroy a tank that weighed 20 tons and cost tens of thousands of dollars to build. German tank doctrine in the war's early years emphasized speed and maneuver. Panzer formations would concentrate at weak points in enemy lines, break through, and exploit deep into the enemy rear. They would bypass strong points, leaving them for infantry to reduce. They would move faster than the enemy could react, creating chaos and collapse. This doctrine worked brilliantly against enemies who lacked effective mobile anti-tank weapons. Polish cavalry could not stop German tanks. French infantry, armed with anti-tank rifles that couldn't penetrate panzer armour at combat ranges, could not stop German tanks. Soviet infantry in 1941, caught by surprise, and often without their anti-tank guns, could not stop German tanks. But American infantry, equipped with 50 caliber machine guns, could stop German tanks. And they did. The first American 50 caliber machine guns arrived in combat in North Africa in November of 1942 during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. Distribution was chaotic. Crates arrived at supply depots with labels that quartermasters didn't recognize. The official designation, Browning machine gun, caliber 50, M2, HB, flexible, meant nothing to soldiers who had never seen the weapon. Some units didn't receive their guns until after the fighting began. Training was nearly non-existent, but the weapon's effectiveness became apparent immediately. American jeeps mounting 50 caliber guns engaged German half-tracks and light armored vehicles. The results shocked both sides. German SD, KFZ, 251 half-tracks, with armor up to 14.5 millimeters thick, were perforated by 50 caliber fire. The rounds punched through the armor, killed the crew, and often ignited the vehicle's fuel. German reconnaissance vehicles, lightly armored cars used for scouting, were similarly vulnerable. A burst from a 50 caliber gun could disable or destroy these vehicles at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Even the Panzer II light tank, with 30 millimeters of side armor, could be penetrated by 50 caliber AP rounds at close range. German intelligence reports from Tunisia in late 1942 and early 1943 noted with concern that American forces possessed large caliber machine guns capable of penetrating light armor. After-action reports described American vehicles with heavy machine guns that could engage German armor from concealed positions. Tank crews reported taking fire from weapons that could damage their vehicles, wounds that standard machine guns could not inflict. The German response was characteristic. They captured several intact 50 caliber Brownings from American units and shipped them back to Germany for immediate analysis. German engineers disassembled the weapons. They measured the components. They tested the ammunition against German armor plate. They recognized immediately that the Americans had created something significant. Not just another machine gun, but a weapon that could challenge the invulnerability that German tank crews had enjoyed. Within months, Germany began developing its own response. But the question that German commanders struggled with was more fundamental. How do you defend against a weapon that is everywhere? The 50 caliber Browning wasn't a specialized anti-tank gun that could be targeted and destroyed. It was a standard infantry weapon. Every American rifle company had them. Every American tank carried one. Every American half-track mounted one. They were in jeeps, on trucks, on tank destroyers, on reconnaissance vehicles. They were in fixed positions and mobile platforms. They could fire from buildings, from foxholes, from behind walls, from concealed positions in vegetation. A German tank crew advancing through a village had to assume that every window could hide a 50 caliber gun, every street corner, every stone wall, every pile of rubble. And if that gun opened fire at close range, aiming at the tank's side or rear armor, the crew was in mortal danger. The weapon could not destroy the heaviest German tanks from the front. A Tiger tank, with 100 millimeters of frontal armor, was effectively immune to 50 caliber fire from any angle. Even a Panther tank, with 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor, could not be penetrated from the front. But tanks don't fight only from the front. They maneuver. They turn to engage threats. They expose their sides and rear. And when they did, the 50 caliber was waiting. Sicily, July 1943. The Allied invasion of Sicily brought American and German forces into close combat across the island's rugged terrain. American jeeps and half-tracks mounting 50 caliber guns proved devastatingly effective in the close-quarters fighting. One engagement near Gela demonstrated the weapon's psychological impact. A German column, including several Panzer IV tanks, was advancing toward the invasion beaches when it came under fire from concealed American positions. The Americans had no anti-tank guns in position, no tank destroyers. What they had were several 50 caliber machine guns mounted on half-tracks. The gunners opened fire, not at the tank's frontal armor, but at the more vulnerable sides and engine compartments. The 50 caliber rounds sparked against the armor. Some ricocheted, but enough penetrated to cause damage and, more importantly, to cause fear. German tank commanders buttoned up, closing their hatches, reducing their visibility. The tanks slowed, hesitated. Infantry that had been advancing with the armor took cover. The momentum of the attack stalled. The beachhead held, not because the 50 caliber guns destroyed the tanks. Most of the tanks survived the engagement. But because the guns forced the German commanders to respect the threat, to slow down, to be cautious, and in combat, hesitation kills momentum. Italy, 1943 through 1944. The Italian campaign saw extensive use of 50 caliber guns in defensive positions. American forces established strongpoints with interlocking fields of fire from multiple 50 caliber machine guns. German counterattacks that attempted to overwhelm these positions with armor and infantry suffered heavy casualties. The guns would allow German tanks to approach, then engage them from the flanks. German after-action reports described the difficulty of advancing under 50 caliber fire. The rounds would strike exposed crew members if they kept their hatches open for better visibility. The rounds would penetrate vision ports, injuring or killing the crew. The rounds would damage external equipment, tracks, and weapons systems. And always, there was the risk that a well-placed burst would penetrate the armor itself. German tank crews began taking precautions. They welded additional armor plates to vulnerable areas. They packed sandbags on engine decks and turret sides. They avoided routes where 50 caliber guns might have clear shots at their flanks. But sandbags and improvised armor added weight, reducing speed and maneuverability. Caution slowed advances. Fear changed tactics. France, June 1944 onward. The Normandy invasion and the subsequent campaign across France brought American 50 caliber guns into the Bocage country. The Bocage was a landscape of small fields enclosed by ancient earthen banks topped with thick hedgerows. Visibility was limited to yards, not hundreds of yards. Every field entrance was a potential ambush site. American forces positioned 50 caliber guns at these choke points. When German armor attempted to move through the Bocage, the results were catastrophic. Tanks would approach a field entrance. The lead tank would enter the narrow gap. A 50 caliber gun, positioned in the hedgerow and invisible until it fired, would open fire at point-blank range against the tank's side armor. At ranges of 50 yards or less, the penetration of armor-piercing 50 caliber ammunition increased dramatically. 30 millimeters of armor, the standard side protection on Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, could be defeated reliably. 20 millimeter rear armor was torn open like paper. The Germans called these ambushes murder. Tank crews spoke of the fear of advancing through terrain where they couldn't see more than one field ahead, where any hedge could hide a gun that could kill them, where stopping was death and advancing was death, and there was no good option. American soldiers developed techniques specifically for engaging German armor with 50 caliber guns. They would position guns in pairs or groups, creating crossfires. When a tank passed the first gun, that gun would engage from the side or rear. When the tank turned to face that threat, exposing a different flank, the second gun would open fire. They would aim for specific vulnerable areas: the engine compartment, where penetration could start fires; the tracks, where enough hits could break a track and immobilize the vehicle; vision ports, which were weak points in the armor; the turret ring, where the turret joined the hull, which had thinner armor to allow rotation. They learned to fire in short, controlled bursts. Sustained fire heated the gun and wore the barrel. Short bursts conserved ammunition and maintained accuracy. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds were preferred. The incendiary effect provided immediate feedback. If the round penetrated and ignited something inside the tank, flames and smoke would appear. The psychological effect on German tank crews cannot be overstated. These were men who had been trained to believe that their tanks made them nearly invincible. Armor was protection, steel walls between them and death. To discover that those steel walls could be penetrated by a weapon that seemed to be everywhere, that could strike from any direction, that could kill you in your supposedly safe metal box, was profoundly demoralizing. German military reports from France in late 1944 described declining morale among tank crews. Veterans who had fought since Poland or France spoke of how the war had changed. In the early years, advancing in a tank felt like being in a fortress. By 1944, it felt like being in a coffin. American veterans of the European campaign described German tank crews they captured or encountered after the war. Many spoke of their fear of the 50 caliber. They called it many things. Some referred to it by onomatopoeia, trying to capture that distinctive sound. The deep, heavy hammering that was unmistakable on the battlefield. Others simply called it the American heavy machine gun. What they all agreed on was that they feared it. One German tanker, captured in France, told his interrogators that he felt safer outside his tank than inside it. The tank attracted fire. Everyone shot at the tank, and some of them had weapons that could penetrate. Better to be infantry, where you could take cover, where you could hide, where a single bullet might miss or might kill you quickly. In the tank, you waited for the round that would penetrate, that would bounce around inside the crew compartment, that would ignite ammunition or fuel. You waited, and you knew it was coming, and there was nothing you could do about it. But the truly legendary demonstration of what a 50 caliber Browning could do in the hands of a skilled and determined soldier came on that frozen January afternoon in 1945, when Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy climbed onto that burning tank destroyer near Holtzwihr. We'll return to Murphy in a moment. First, we need to understand the broader context of what American production meant for this weapon. Part 2. American industry produced approximately 2 million Browning 50 caliber machine guns of all types during World War II. Of these, roughly 350,000 were M2 heavy barrel models intended for ground use. The remaining guns were lighter aircraft variants, designated AN/M2, designed specifically for installation in fighters and bombers. The production scale was staggering. Companies that had never manufactured firearms were retooled to produce machine guns. General Motors divisions, including Frigidaire in Dayton, Ohio, and AC Sparkplug in Flint, Michigan, turned out thousands of guns. High Standard, Savage Arms, Buffalo Arms, Kelsey Hayes, and Colt all joined the production effort. In September of 1940, General Motors received a $61.4 million contract to produce over 71,000 machine guns of 4 types. One of those types was the 50 caliber. By the time the contract was fulfilled, American aircraft, vehicles, and infantry units had more heavy machine guns than any army in history. The ammunition production was even more impressive. Billions of rounds. Not millions. Billions. The exact number is difficult to verify from available records, but estimates suggest that American industry produced enough 50 caliber ammunition to fire every M2 in existence for hours of continuous operation. Standard ammunition loading for combat operations was a mix of rounds: 2 ball rounds for general-purpose use, 2 armor-piercing incendiary rounds for anti-armor and anti-aircraft work, 1 tracer round for fire observation and correction. This 5-round pattern was assembled into belts using spring clips, called disintegrating links. The links fed through the gun's mechanism and were stripped away as each round was fired, falling to the ground or the vehicle floor. A gunner could see his bullet's path through the tracers. He could adjust his aim. He could watch the API rounds strike their targets and ignite. The feedback was immediate and devastating. Compare this to what German forces possessed. Germany produced the MG-42 machine gun, one of the finest infantry weapons of the war. Over 400,000 were manufactured. The MG-42 fired the 7.92mm Mauser round, the same cartridge used in German rifles. It was an excellent weapon for suppressing infantry, but it could not penetrate armor. Germany also produced the 13mm MG-131 aircraft machine gun and the 15mm MG-151 cannon. These were powerful weapons, but they were mounted exclusively on aircraft. German ground forces had no equivalent to the 50 caliber Browning. No portable heavy machine gun that could engage both infantry and light armor. No weapon that could be mounted on jeeps, half-tracks, and tanks to provide multi-role firepower. The disparity extended to every category of equipment. American factories produced 88,000 tanks during the war. Germany produced approximately 25,000. American shipyards launched over 150 aircraft carriers of all types. Germany produced 0 fleet carriers. American arsenals turned out nearly 300,000 military aircraft. Germany produced approximately 120,000. These numbers tell a story that German commanders understood, but could not overcome. They were fighting an industrial war against an enemy with vastly superior productive capacity. Every tank Germany destroyed would be replaced by 3 American tanks. Every aircraft shot down would be replaced by 2 more. Every soldier killed would be replaced by fresh troops with better equipment, more ammunition, and unwavering supply lines. And every one of those American soldiers, vehicles, and positions might have a .50 caliber Browning ready to fire. German veterans who wrote memoirs after the war frequently mentioned the abundance of American equipment. One Panzer commander described an engagement in France where his company destroyed several American tanks, only to watch twice as many replacements arrive the next day. An infantry officer spoke of calling for artillery support and receiving a handful of shells, while American positions seemed to have unlimited ammunition. They could fire for hours. They could saturate entire areas with explosives. They never seemed to run out. A tank crew survivor described the sound of American .50 caliber fire as one of the most distinctive and feared sounds of the war. The deep hammering, the steady rhythm, the knowledge that those rounds could penetrate your vehicle's side armor. One veteran called it the sound of American industrial power made audible. Every burst was a reminder that you were fighting an enemy that could afford to expend ammunition at rates you could never match. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. German soldiers in the war's early years had fought with confidence. They possessed superior equipment, better training, and a string of victories that seemed to prove their superiority. By 1944, that confidence had evaporated. They knew they were losing. They knew their supply lines were collapsing. They knew that every battle would be fought against enemies who had more of everything: tanks, planes, artillery, ammunition, food, fuel. More. Always more. And among those resources that American forces seemed to possess in unlimited quantities was the .50 caliber Browning. It was on every vehicle. It was in every defensive position. It was mounted on aircraft that filled the skies. It was everywhere, and it could kill you. Now we return to Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy on that frozen afternoon near Holtzwihr. Murphy was not a large man. He stood 5 feet 5 inches tall. He weighed 112 pounds when he enlisted in the army in June of 1942. He had lied about his age. He was 16 years old, though he claimed to be 18. The Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Army Air Corps all rejected him as too small, too young, too frail. The Army finally accepted him. He was assigned to the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. His first combat was in Sicily in July of 1943. He was 18 years old. Over the next 19 months, Murphy fought through Sicily, Italy, and France. He was promoted from private to sergeant to second lieutenant through battlefield promotions. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. He earned 2 Silver Star medals. He earned 2 Bronze Star medals for valor. He was wounded 3 times. By January of 1945, he had been in combat almost continuously for a year and a half. He had seen hundreds of men die. He had killed many enemy soldiers. He suffered from what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1945 it was called battle fatigue or shell shock, and soldiers were expected to simply endure it. On January 14, 1945, Murphy returned to his unit after recovering from a hip wound sustained in October. He was assigned to lead Company B of the 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, near the French village of Holtzwihr in the Colmar Pocket. The Colmar Pocket was a German-held salient in Alsace, eastern France. German forces had been pushed back across most of France following the Normandy invasion, but they clung to this pocket of territory, using it to threaten Allied supply lines and prevent the complete liberation of France. The fighting in the Colmar Pocket was brutal. Winter weather made movement difficult. Snow and ice covered the ground. Visibility was limited. German forces, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with determination, born of desperation. They knew they were defending the approaches to Germany itself. On January 26th, Murphy's company was positioned in open terrain near Holtzwihr. They had 128 men. They were supported by two M10 tank destroyers and some artillery pieces positioned to the rear. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, German forces attacked. 6 tanks advanced down the road toward Murphy's position. They were accompanied by approximately 250 German infantrymen in white winter camouflage. The Germans had chosen their moment carefully. Fog and snow reduced visibility. American air support could not fly in such weather. The attack was a coordinated, combined arms assault, tanks and infantry working together to overwhelm the American position. Murphy immediately recognized the danger. His company was in the open. They had minimal cover. If the German tanks reached their position, supported by that many infantry, his company would be destroyed. He ordered his men to withdraw to prepared positions in the woods behind them. The withdrawal would be covered by artillery fire that Murphy would direct by telephone from his forward command post. His men began falling back. The 2 tank destroyers provided covering fire. German shells hammered the American position. One of the M10 tank destroyers, positioned about 50 yards to Murphy's right and slightly behind him, took a direct hit. The shell penetrated the open-topped fighting compartment. The vehicle erupted in flames. Ammunition inside the vehicle began to cook off, exploding in secondary detonations. The crew of 5 men abandoned the burning vehicle and fled to the woods. The M10 sat there, burning, smoke pouring from its interior, fire spreading to the engine compartment. At any moment, the remaining ammunition and fuel could explode, turning the vehicle into a massive fireball. Murphy continued directing artillery fire by telephone. His forward observer called in coordinates. American artillery shells began falling among the advancing Germans. Men fell. The attack slowed. But the tanks kept coming, and 250 infantrymen were more than Murphy's depleted company could handle in a straight fight. With the German tanks now parallel to his position, Murphy made his decision. He told the officer on the other end of the telephone line, "If you see me wave my hand from atop that tank destroyer, bring the artillery in closer, even if it means hitting me." Then he climbed onto the burning M10. The tank destroyer was an open-topped vehicle, built on a modified Sherman tank chassis. It mounted a 3-inch gun in an open fighting compartment protected by sloped armor plates. The 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun was mounted on a pedestal near the commander's position. Murphy reached the gun. It was still loaded. The ammunition belt fed from a box attached to the mount. The gun was ready to fire. He gripped the handles. The spade grips felt cold, even through his gloves. The trigger was positioned between the grips. He aimed at the advancing German infantry, and he opened fire. The 50 caliber roared. The sound was enormous. Each shot was a physical impact, a hammer blow of sound and recoil. The gun bucked against its mount. Spent shell casings flew from the ejection port, brass cartridges spinning through the air and falling around Murphy's feet. The belt fed through the gun with mechanical precision. Each round was stripped from the belt, chambered, fired, and ejected in a fraction of a second. 450 rounds per minute, 7.5 rounds per second. Murphy fired in short bursts, the way he had been trained. He swept the gun across the advancing infantry. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck German soldiers. Men fell. Others took cover. The advance stalled. German infantry, who had been moving with confidence, suddenly found themselves under fire from a weapon they had learned to fear. Murphy shifted his aim to the tanks. He could not penetrate the frontal armor. He knew that. But he could target the vision ports. He could aim at the tracks. He could force the tank commanders to button up, closing their hatches, reducing their visibility. Most importantly, he could keep the German infantry from advancing with the tanks. Infantry and armor worked together, separate them, and both became vulnerable. Murphy fired burst after burst. His position was completely exposed. He was standing on top of a burning vehicle, silhouetted against the smoke, visible to every German soldier and tank gunner in the field. German forces concentrated their fire on him. Machine gun rounds sparked against the M10's armor. Rifle bullets cracked past his head. Tank shells exploded nearby, showering him with frozen dirt and shrapnel. The M10 continued to burn beneath him. Smoke choked him. Heat from the fire made the metal plates hot to the touch, even in the freezing weather. Ammunition inside the vehicle continued to explode in random detonations. Each explosion sent a shudder through the vehicle's frame. Murphy stood there, holding the gun, firing. The German infantry attempted to flank him. A squad of soldiers began crawling up a drainage ditch that approached Murphy's position from the side. They moved carefully, using the ditch for cover, getting closer. 20 yards. 15 yards. 10 yards. Murphy saw them. He traversed the .50 caliber gun toward the ditch. He fired directly into it. The armor-piercing rounds tore through the German soldiers at point-blank range. The entire squad was killed or wounded. None escaped. The attack from that direction ended. Murphy returned his fire to the main body of German infantry. His telephone line was still connected. He continued calling in artillery corrections, bringing American shells down closer and closer to his own position. "Bring it in 50 yards, he would say. Then, moments later, "Bring it in another 50 yards. The artillery officer on the other end of the line, Captain Nolan, protested. "That will land right on top of you." Murphy's response was calm. "That's where I want it." American artillery shells began falling among the German forces. The combination of artillery fire and Murphy's machine gun fire broke the German attack. Infantry that had been advancing began to fall back. The tanks, without infantry support and unable to see Murphy's exact position through the smoke and limited visibility, began to withdraw. German casualties mounted. Murphy continued firing. For over an hour, he stood on that burning tank destroyer, exposed to enemy fire, alone, and he fought. German reports from the battle, captured later, indicated they believed they were facing a reinforced company with multiple machine gun positions. They could not believe that the volume of fire they were receiving came from a single soldier with a single weapon. When the German attack finally broke and withdrew, Murphy had expended all the ammunition in the vehicle. The .50 caliber gun was empty. He climbed down from the M10 and returned to his forward command post. Only then did his men notice that he was wounded. He had been hit in the leg during the battle, but had continued fighting. He had not mentioned it during the hour he spent on the tank destroyer. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Murphy's action at Holtzwihr killed an estimated 20 to 50 German soldiers, though exact numbers are difficult to verify. More importantly, his action prevented the German forces from overrunning his company's position. 102 of his 128 men had been killed or wounded by the time the battle ended, but the survivors held their ground. The next day, American reinforcements arrived and pushed the Germans back. Murphy was evacuated for treatment of his leg wound. On April 23, 1945, Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Holtzwihr. He was 19 years old. The citation described his actions in understated military language. Climbed on the burning tank destroyer, which was in danger of blowing up at any moment, and employed its .50 caliber machine gun against the enemy. It did not capture the full scope of what he had done, standing alone against 6 tanks and 250 infantry, directing artillery fire while under direct enemy fire, fighting for over an hour on a vehicle that could explode at any second, never retreating, never surrendering, fighting until the ammunition was gone and the enemy was defeated. Murphy survived the war. He became a national celebrity, featured on the cover of Life magazine in July of 1945 as America's most decorated soldier. Actor James Cagney saw the magazine cover and brought Murphy to Hollywood. Murphy starred in 44 films over the next 20 years, including To Hell and Back, in which he played himself in an adaptation of his autobiography. But Murphy carried scars that no one could see. He suffered from what is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. He had nightmares about the war. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He struggled with relationships and with civilian life. In 1969, Murphy spoke publicly about his condition, calling on the government to provide better mental health care for combat veterans. He was one of the first major public figures to acknowledge that combat trauma was a real medical condition requiring treatment. Murphy died in a plane crash on May 28, 1971. He was 45 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His grave is one of the most visited sites at Arlington, second only to President John F. Kennedy's grave in the number of visitors it receives each year. The .50 caliber Browning that Murphy used at Holtzwihr was one of hundreds of thousands in American service. What made his action extraordinary was not the weapon, but the man using it and the circumstances in which he used it. But Murphy's action demonstrated what the .50 caliber could do in the hands of a determined soldier. It could stop tanks. It could defeat infantry. It could turn the tide of a battle. The weapon gave American forces a capability that no other army possessed in such abundance. A portable, versatile, devastatingly powerful machine gun that could engage any target on the battlefield. German commanders understood what they faced, but understanding and countering are different things. You cannot counter a weapon that is everywhere. You cannot develop tactics against a threat that can appear from any direction at any time. You cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy that can replace every loss twice over, while you struggle to replace anything at all. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Western Allies were across the Rhine. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east. German armies that had conquered most of Europe were being ground down by forces they could no longer resist. Among the many factors that contributed to Germany's defeat was a simple machine gun designed by an American gunsmith in 1918. The .50 caliber Browning had not won the war by itself. No single weapon wins wars, but it had changed the battlefield in ways that German forces never fully adapted to. It had given American infantry the power to fight armor. It had given American vehicles and positions firepower that could defeat almost any threat. It had demonstrated that industrial capacity, properly applied, could produce weapons that shifted the balance of combat in fundamental ways. German tank crews who survived the war spoke of many weapons they had feared. The Soviet 34 tank with its sloped armor and powerful gun, the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, the American P-47 fighter bomber with its rockets and bombs. But when they spoke of weapons that had changed how they fought on a daily basis, that had made them cautious and fearful in situations where they should have felt safe, they spoke of the .50 caliber Browning. They spoke of the sound it made, the deep, steady hammering that meant American forces were nearby. They spoke of the psychological impact of knowing that a weapon that could penetrate their armor was mounted on every American Jeep, every American half-track, every American tank. They spoke of the fear of advancing through terrain where that weapon could be hiding anywhere. One German veteran, interviewed decades after the war, was asked what weapon he had feared most. He thought for a moment, then said simply, "The American .50 caliber. It was everywhere. You could never escape it." That ubiquity was the key. The weapon's effectiveness came not just from its technical capabilities, though those were formidable. It came from the fact that American forces possessed so many of them that German troops had to assume every engagement might involve .50 caliber fire. The psychological burden of that assumption was crushing. Every advance was more cautious, every movement was more careful, every decision was influenced by the fear of encountering a weapon that could kill you through armor that was supposed to protect you. German military doctrine had been built on speed and aggression. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, concentrated armored formations breaking through enemy lines and exploiting deep into the rear. By 1944, that doctrine had become nearly impossible to execute against American forces. The .50 caliber machine gun was one of many reasons why. It forced German armor to slow down, to coordinate more carefully with infantry, to avoid exposed flanks, to respect threats that earlier in the war would have been dismissed as irrelevant. The weapon's legacy extends far beyond World War II. The M2 Browning remains in service today, over 100 years after its initial design. Modern American forces still use it. It arms vehicles, aircraft, and ships. It serves as a defensive weapon and an offensive weapon. It has been used in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and every conflict American forces have engaged in since 1945. 3 million M2 Brownings have been produced since 1921. The weapon has been manufactured under license by multiple countries. It has been copied and adapted by others. It is one of the most successful weapon designs in history, measured by longevity, production numbers, and continued relevance. The 50 BMG cartridge, developed specifically for this weapon, has found uses far beyond machine guns. Modern anti-material rifles chamber the 50 BMG round, giving infantry the ability to engage vehicles, equipment, and fortifications at extreme ranges. Snipers have used 50 caliber rifles to engage targets at distances exceeding 2,000 meters. The cartridge that Winchester developed in 1918 to meet General Pershing's requirement continues to serve American forces today. When German tank crews first encountered the 50 caliber Browning in North Africa in 1942, they recognized immediately that something had changed. A weapon that could penetrate their armor, carried by infantry, mounted on light vehicles, available in seemingly unlimited quantities, represented a threat they had not anticipated and could not counter. They adapted their tactics. They improved their armor. They became more cautious. But they could not escape the fundamental reality that American industrial power had produced a weapon that shifted the balance of combat. That shift was not dramatic or immediate. The 50 caliber did not win battles by itself, but it influenced every battle. It changed how German forces fought. It made them hesitant where they had been aggressive. It made them fearful where they had been confident. And accumulated over thousands of engagements, across North Africa and Sicily and Italy and France and Germany, that hesitation and that fear contributed to defeat. The title of this script suggested that German tank crews were terrified when the 50 caliber tore through 40mm armor. The reality is more nuanced. The weapon could penetrate 30mm of side armor reliably, 20mm of rear armor. 40mm was marginal, possible at very close range or at favorable angles, but not guaranteed. But the terror was real. Not because every round penetrated, but because enough rounds penetrated that tank crews could never feel safe. That uncertainty, that knowledge that the armor protecting you might fail at any moment, was psychologically devastating. War is often described in terms of grand strategy, major battles, and decisive moments. The landings at Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine. But wars are won and lost in the accumulation of small advantages. A weapon that gives your infantry the power to fight enemy armor. An industrial base that can produce that weapon in quantities your enemy cannot match. A supply system that ensures every unit has ammunition and every soldier has the tools he needs. The 50 caliber Browning M2 was one of those small advantages. It was not the reason the Allies won World War II. But it was one of thousands of factors that combined to make Allied victory inevitable. German commanders understood what they faced. Some recognized it early. Others learned through bitter experience. But by 1944, every German soldier knew that American forces possessed firepower they could not match. The 50 caliber machine gun was part of that firepower, a symbol of American industrial might. A weapon that could kill you through armor that should have kept you safe. A sound that meant the Americans were near and you were in danger. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy demonstrated what one man with 150 caliber machine gun could accomplish under impossible circumstances. He stood alone on a burning vehicle and fought off an entire German company. He saved his men and held his position. He earned the Medal of Honor and became a symbol of American courage and determination. But Murphy's weapon was not unique. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers had access to 50 caliber machine guns. Not all of them used them with Murphy's extraordinary skill or courage, but all of them benefited from possessing a weapon that German forces had learned to fear. That was the true power of the 50 caliber Browning. Not what it could do in the hands of America's most decorated soldier, but what it did in the hands of ordinary soldiers, day after day, battle after battle, across every theater of the war. It gave American forces an advantage, a capability that their enemies could not match, and accumulated over years of combat, those advantages decided the war. The German tank crews who survived World War II returned to a destroyed nation. Their stories were not celebrated for decades. Germany's defeat was total. Its military was disbanded. Its soldiers were regarded with suspicion and shame. But when historians finally began interviewing these veterans, seeking to understand the war from the German perspective, a consistent theme emerged. They had been outfought, outmanned, and outproduced. They had faced enemies with more tanks, more planes, more artillery, and more ammunition than they could ever hope to match. And among the specific weapons they mentioned as particularly feared and respected, the American .50 caliber Browning appeared again and again. Not the most powerful weapon they faced, not the most advanced, but the most ubiquitous, the most inescapable, the weapon that represented everything they could not overcome: American industrial power, American abundance, American determination to produce and deploy weapons in quantities that made victory inevitable. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.